Everybody, welcome back to Van Halen Stories, episode number 12 on Final Resonance TV. Today, my guest is Mike Wolf, all the way from Los Angeles, California. Mike is, if you've watched any of my Van Halen Stories episodes, then you need to watch, if you haven't watched them, watch the last one with Craig Parker Adams. And check that out because Mike's story connects to Craig's story through a really interesting period when different kind of truth was being made. And Mike was part of a team put together with Dweezil Zappa and Eddie Van Halen to get together material for that album that eventually came out with Different Kind of Truth, and then later an album that never came out again. So thanks for being on, Mike. And, you know, Mike goes back. Mike's actually my first guest that was at a Pasadena Civic show. He's a Pasadena native, right?
Yep.
Okay. So you're my first Pasadena native, and I'm glad to finally get that to happen because I really wanted that to happen. But Mike's a producer and engineer out of Los Angeles, and you've been out there your whole life.
Yep. I was born here, and I was born in Glendale, right next to Pasadena, and been around here in Southern California my whole life. I
got a question for you. I'm gonna throw you a bone right out of the top of the thing because it just hit me right now. Was there a rivalry between Van Halen and Quiet Riot since you were right there in Glendale? Or do you remember?
Yeah, I saw Quiet Riot before they made it, before Randy took off for Ozzy. And, it wasn't really a rivalry. They weren't even really in the same leagues or even trying to do the same thing. They were, Quiet Riot was really trying to be very British, very glam. They had a lot of spandex makeup and girls' clothes, and Roth and Van Halen were just kind of like heavy. They were more macho, more, like dude music, so it really was apples and oranges.
Okay. Because that's, that new documentary just came out on Randy Rhodes. There's a lot of people that say that, but then Greg Leonon was on here too, and he didn't think it was.
Yeah. Well, no, I agree with Greg. It was a good friend of mine. I've known him forever as well. And, the band with Greg Leon that was called Dubrow after Randy took off was a much better band than Quiet Riot, as far as I'm concerned. Randy Rhodes is a great guitarist and, a legend, and it's sad that he's not with us anymore, but he really blossomed in Ozzy, not so much in Quiet Riot. That's the way I saw it. And that's what I heard.
And, listening back, you can hear him starting, you could hear elements of what he would become with Ozzy. But you're right.
Yeah. But I mean, just think about it. You get the chance. You're with Ozzy Osbourne. That's like big time. So just knowing that fact in your head, and you're in the studio and you have to come up with stuff, you're going to come up with your best stuff. You got bitchin' studio, no holds barred. I mean, when you're with Quiet Riot, it's like, they're like, constraints and, Russian and, everything is like it.
Right.
Some kind of restricted attempt. But, he came up with way better stuff when he was with Ozzy than he did in Quiet Riot.
Yeah. The songwriting was, great, and we know that Bob Daisley was involved in a lot of that in the early days. That's just something that had come up over the last 6 months or few months as the new Randy Rhodes thing hit. And I was wondering what your take was on it. But you go all the way back to Pasadena. You said you were class of 77 at Pasadena High School. Is that right?
Actually, John Muir High School, crosstown rivals.
Okay, so you're at Ross High School, at David Lee Roth High School.
That's right.
Okay.
Yes, indeed.
So I've been to Pasadena, and I've done I did a thing on my channel called the Van Halen Trail, where I did a site-by-site travel around Pasadena, and one of the places I didn't get was John Muir, but I intended to. I did the Pasadena City College. I did the Los Lunas home, Pasadena High School, Ross House over there, not too far away, So I've been around and done that. And Pasadena Civic, of course, was a place that I went. But that's your hometown. So you in 75 and 76 told me that this is before you're out of high school. This is still in high school. You were you friended some guys that were older than you, and they introduced you to Van Halen when they were in Pasadena before they were famous in 75 or 76. What's the first time that you saw these guys?
Well, it's kind of like that's my story that leads into how this even happened for me. And I'm going to put on my glasses here so I can read my notes.
Right on. Go for it.
Hold on one second.
Sure.
There was a little thing on the screen. Okay, so basically it's this, is that my parents moved out to California in like 1958, lived in Long Beach. My dad was a doctor, and he got hired to work at a place in Eagle Rock, which is a small town in between Pasadena and Glendale.
Okay.
So at first we lived in a city called Highland Park, which was this, just kind of nice, all-American average city. And we lived in this brand new housing tract, and they had, this is the early 60s we're talking about, and they had names of the street like Easy Street and Fortune Way. And so we lived on Easy Street, and
wow.
Everybody had the same looking house, and everyone was just like the same everything. There was no struggle, no class struggle, no bullies. Everything was really mellow and cool and fun. I had a lot of friends around there, and then my brother was born, and we needed a bigger house, basically. And so my dad moved us to Pasadena, still close to Eagle Rock on the west border of Pasadena, and we lived there. So we moved there, but it was a major culture shock for me. I had a lot of friends back in Highland Park. I was only, in second grade at the time, and here I had to start all over again and meet friends. And the kids in Pasadena were mean. It was like there was a lot of rich kids compared to where I lived in Highland Park, and they wanted you to know that. And there was attitudes, there was bullies, there was just competition. Okay. And racism, absolutely. I mean, that was just part of the terrain back then, anyway. But especially in Pasadena. Okay. So it was an adjustment period for me in Pasadena to begin with. But I was basically this nerdy Jewish kid trying to find my way, in this new town. Okay. And I played the violin starting from age 10. And I played the violin in the orchestras all the way through the end of high school, right? Right. And so how this comes into the Van Halen thing is somewhere in like 74, I'm in John Muir High School, I'm in the orchestra, and one of the girls, the flute players, who's also Jewish, says, "Hey, you should join our Jewish youth group. We get together, we have parties, we do all these fun things, we have dances." She invited me to go check it out. And I'm like, sure. Well, I got to ask my parents. And they're like, oh, yeah, absolutely. They want me to meet Jewish kids. I'm like, okay, that's great. No problems. So first thing that happens, this guy drives to my parents' house to pick me up because I don't have a car, right? He drives me over there, picks me up. And this guy's name is Eddie Langholtz. Okay. And he's from PHS, from the other side of town. He's going to drive me to the Pasadena Jewish Temple, which is, again, other side of Pasadena. I don't know these people. These are PHS people. So right away, he starts telling me about himself. He's a guitar player. He has his own band. He's tied in with other musicians. Chris Holmes is a close friend of his and classmate. And then there's this band, Van Halen, and they're going to make it someday. And the guitar player is amazing, la, 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 la. So, for me, I didn't have any older brothers and sisters. So I was yearning for anything an older kid might be paying attention to me for. And anything that this guy was selling to me, I was buying. So right away, I was excited. And sure enough, we had a lot of fun in these youth group meetings. And one of the things that was happening back then is they would throw dances. And the first dance that they put on was at this temple, and guess who the band was? Buster Savage, Chris Holmes' band. And he gets up there and they're playing, Zeppelin and Hendrix and all the, copies of the day, and talking about early 70s, mid 70s. And Chris did this funny thing where he had all long blonde hair. He had it all hidden up under a cowboy hat. And he'd come out with his cowboy hat on, and all his hair's hidden in there. And he'd, big, tall guy, come out and start playing like Communication Breakdown. And then he'd go boom and throw his hat off. All his hair would come flying out, and he'd just start head banging. And he's just a big, imposing looking dude anyway. So it was like, whoa, so scary, so fun. Right. So that was like a great taste of rock and roll to begin with, and I was really enamored of the whole. Next things that happen is I start going to see Van Halen play at the Pasadena Civic. Now, early on, 74, I don't even know if they were playing at the Civic yet. And I was too young to drive. I'm still a 14, 15-year-old kid. But by the time I'm 16, I'm driving my mom's car. I got my license the day I turned 16. And, I started heading over to see backyard parties with Van Halen and going to the Pasadena Civic shows. The way you knew about these things is because they would have people come out to all the high schools. There was 3 high schools in Pasadena, and they would stuff a flyer in every locker. You'd open up your locker and there's some flyer. Oh, Saturday night, Van Halen, Battle of the Bands, Pasadena Civic 250 with this flyer, and you'd be like, oh, cool, right. And it was the scene. They were loud, hard rock music, which I was really starting to get into at that time. I was a big Zeppelin fan, and Deep Purple, Rainbow, Robin Trower, all that stuff was my favorite. I started playing all that music and getting into that scene. And then I would go to these backyard parties, and there would be, you'd know you were at the party because you could already hear the music walking up the street, because you had to park like 3 or 4 blocks away because there were so many kids already there at someone's backyard. You finally get up in here and it's like $2.50 to get in, or $2, big kegger party. You get inside there, and they were set up on this stage that they made, and it was a pool in this backyard, but this huge stage made out of milk cartons and pieces of plywood. Alex would be way up in the air. Ed had his bomb up on a big riser, and they were playing, and they had flash pots. So they go, and boom, Alex would hit this button, and the flames and smoke would come piling up, and he had his car horns hooked up to another button. It'd be beep, 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 beep. So they had all these gimmicks and all this crazy stuff going, and they were loud as hell, so loud. Luckily, when they're outdoors, you could take it. When they were indoors at those Civic gigs, sometimes it was hard to take because it was just so damn loud. Right, but these parties wouldn't last long because the neighbors would hear this, and they'd call the cops. So the cops would come in less than an hour every time. And the cops would come by and, all right, let me see. Everyone's like putting away their weed and, the beer, underage kids. And so everyone starts scattering. And that was the Van Halen backyard party,
Right. So he had his bomb. And what year was that? The bomb was, what year was this?
Oh, I don't even know when he started with the bomb, because, I jumped in, like I said, around 75. But he had that bomb going, and the bomb was just there to hold. It had a shelf inside, and I think he had 1 or 2 little Univox Echo boxes,
right.
Which I got into later. Yeah. So, and other guys in other bands in Pasadena copied his idea to have something holding their Echoplex. Like an Echoplex is a bigger, more expensive box. Yeah. And Terry Kilgore, for instance, he had like a mannequin, holding. And he'd have 2 Echoplexes, and Carlos Cavazo in the band Snow would do the same thing as well. Something to hold that echo, just like Eddie did with his bomb.
What did Carlos put his in?
I'm trying to remember whether it was Carlos who had the mannequin or Terry Kilgore. It's possible that it was Carlos that had a female mannequin with lingerie on, and then Terry just had a bunch of milk cartons holding his up, something like that.
Okay. Yeah, that's wild. Yeah, Chris Holmes, there's a video on my channel and about the cabinets that Eddie had at one point, the ones without the Tolex on them, and that Greg told me those were Chris's, or that I think Eddie had some, but Chris would let him borrow his, and these particular ones without the Tolex. Now, this is Greg's story. I don't know. He said the reason they didn't have Tolex is because Chris Holmes said they were stolen. I don't know if that's true or not, but you'd have to ask Chris.
Some of those guys were like big and mean. When you're talking about someone like Chris Holmes or Terry Kilgore, those guys you didn't want to get on the wrong side of. You don't want to ask too many questions.
I've seen Chris before live, and I know you're right. He is giant. He's what? I don't know how big he is. He's got to be 6'6".
Got to be 6'4", 6'5", something like that. I have no idea.
Yeah, a very imposing figure. And yeah, so you're going to these parties, and now when the Pasadena Civic thing started, the lore around it is that they would throw their own parties there, or they would throw their own shows. Would they like book it themselves and then promote it, and then they would pay for the cost of it through the show? They would just literally pay for it themselves and then pay for the cost through their sales.
Well, the way it went, to my understanding and what I saw, firsthand, is that there's these local promoters, like a couple of guys would get together and go through whatever red tape to rent out it's not the Pasadena Civic Auditorium, which is a really nice auditorium with a balcony and seats and a stage. It's next door to the right. It's called the Pasadena Exhibition Hall, which was a place where they had like conventions there and, exhibits. And all it was a giant concrete room, a giant rectangular concrete room. So it was echoey in there. Oh my God, it had a like 20, 30-foot ceiling. It was half underground. So you'd have to go down these stairs to get into the place, and just a giant room. So Van Halen would be usually at one end of the room, and most of the time there would be like a total of 6 to 8 bands. They'd have Van Halen on one end, a whole other band on the other end, and 3 bands on each side. As soon as one would stop, the next one would start. But it was so echoey and loud in there. When there was a lot of people, that would soak up some of the sound. But, if there wasn't, man, that sound was bouncing off the walls. And Van Halen was always the loudest one there. So it was hard to take. We would say we were getting a Van headache.
Right. So that's something I never knew, Mike, is that it was not in the theater that we know as the place where they film American Idol some, and it was.
Oh, yeah, no, that's the Pasadena Civic Auditorium, which is a nice place. That's a real theater.
Right.
They played in the exhibition hall next door.
So they never played in that room?
No, but they did play at the Pasadena City College Theater, which is a similar legitimate theater room. Okay. They played there. But to go back to that story about how they put these things on, there was local promoters that would rent out the hall, put out the flyers, and then you'd have to negotiate with Van Halen. So here's my funny story, is that this Jewish youth group that I belonged to, we would put on these dances for our, various chapters, and there are all these girls chapters. Of course, we wanted to get them out here. And so we put on a big show at the Pasadena Civic Exhibition Hall, and we hired Van Halen. We figured, well, that'll help pack the place. But the main thing is we'll bring in this other band called Supper's Ready. Supper's Ready was like a top 40 band, and they were really good, great vocals, knew all the songs. I mean, they were playing The Outlaws, Greengrass, and High Tides, and all these cool songs of the 70s. And the girls would love to dance to them, and they sounded great. They were just like so professional. Right. We put on a show. We hired Van Halen. And the funny story is this: when you approach Van Halen, you're dealing with Alex. It's his band, basically. So he's the enforcer. So you go up to Alex and you go, all right, we want to do a show at the Civic. What do you guys charge to put on a show? We want to do something in May. And he's like, okay, we want $500 up front and 50% of the door. And we're like, $500? Who do you guys think you are? Led Zeppelin?
I've heard that story before. There's a story. Yeah. There's a story around that, right, where he says something like, I forgot. Somebody went back to him later and said that, right?
Well, it's funny because when I got to hang with him again much later, I reminded him of that story, and he goes, yeah. He goes, was I wrong?
That's what I've heard. I've heard that story, and maybe that was in Greg's book. Is that where it was?
Yeah, it probably, because I probably told Greg that story, but it's true. And Alex was in charge, and he was just making sure nobody was taking advantage of them. And he was absolutely right. The problem for our show was is that Supper's Ready played, and everyone loved them. The girls were out there. We were having a beautiful time. And then they finished. Van Halen comes up, and the Van Halen crowd comes surging up towards the stage. Now we're talking about bikers and Hollywood people, and kind of a rougher crowd than ours. and they start playing, and they are twice as loud as this other band, no contest. Right. And they're playing round, jump, jump, round, wah! And so the girls right away are going, ew. They hated it, and so most of the girls from our group left. Right. But it didn't matter because Van Halen's group took over, and Alex was right. We sold out, and they did as they always do. They were a big success at the Civic.
Yeah, I was going to say there are pictures. Now, this is one of the reasons I was asking you about that. The difference between the two rooms is because I've seen pictures that are in that exhibition hall, but I didn't realize it was the same. It was a different room.
You know, the exhibition hall was such a huge room, and maybe the tall ceiling helped it be a little less of a acoustic nightmare. You know, because if you think about it as an audio engineer, I think about a rectangular concrete room. That's like a terrible place to put on a concert. But if you have enough people in there and other objects to absorb some sound and maybe a tall ceiling, you can, soften it up a little bit. But what I remember was all the bands that would be there. We'd have these other bands like Ready Kilowatt with Terry Kilgore, as I mentioned. There'd be Stormer, Smile, Smokehouse. Stormer was an amazing band because they had this guitar player that we used to refer to as Uncle Fester, because he, even though he might have been 30 years old, who knows, he looked a little bit older, but he was losing his hair. He was a little bit heavy set, and he just reminded me of Uncle Fester. So his name was Jim Bates. And Jim Bates was probably the only competition to Ed at that point. Ed was just so clearly better than everyone. But Jim Bates, he was a left-handed player who took a right-handed guitar and just flipped it over. So not only was he playing like Hendrix, but he was playing upside down. So if he's bending a note, it's not whoa, it's like he's pulling it downwards. Yeah. And this guy had all these stretched out patterns and crazy stuff like Ed ended up doing on Ice Cream Man. It's possible Ed lifted that concept from Jim Bates. Jim Bates was an amazing guitarist. I don't know whatever happened to him after that.
Well, one thing you just said kind of struck with me is those patterns, that people tend to give Alan Holdsworth the credit for those wide stretches, but he was doing those in 78 before I'm aware that Ed knew much about Holdsworth. Now, I don't know. I mean, it could have been he knew about Holdsworth in 78, but I don't know, man. That the Ice Cream Man pattern is that pattern he went on to use forever. It was very Holdsworthian, yeah, for sure. But I just don't see how that timeline matches. Somebody could probably tell us in the comments if there's a way it matches. But
I don't know for certain, but I'd say there's a strong chance that Ed may have lifted that idea. As we all players were always looking for something to steal, and it's possible that Ed saw Jim Bates do those kind of things and made up his own version of him. Yeah.
Sure, yeah. And, there's a constant thing that Greg and I've talked about, almost, Greg Renoff and Greg Leon, I think, that Edward, because you were there, man, when he was about to hit the 77, 78 before the album came out. And we all, at least through what we can find on bootlegs, which you're kind of an expert at, we'll get into that, see a transition he makes, because there are eruptions, at least from what I've been able to find, where in 77 he's not tapping yet, but not long after, I want to say in the fall, right close to the album when they're making it, October, that he makes this transition. Like you mentioned with Randy Rhodes, there was this movement that happened in the space of time. I think Roth, they had some time where the record company they were signed, they couldn't get recorded because Templeman couldn't get with them. And they had some time where they didn't gig so much. And it seemed like Roth went and got some vocal lessons. We know about that. And Edward, there's something happened there where all of a sudden, all of the things that he was working on, you could hear pieces of and elements of, came together. And that 78 album came out, and everything that we know about Edward Van Halen that became history came together. Do you recognize that, or is that something that I'm just putting together?
No, I think you're absolutely right, and those kind of details are really like inside stuff, and I think a lot of that was revealed through Greg Renoff's research and discussions with Ted Templeman. And I think what we came to learn is that Van Halen, they had a chance to really prepare for that record. Like they came in and did that 25 song demo real fast. And if you listen to that, it's sloppy. They don't even care. You could tell it's just like a, just whatever. They're not trying to make it great. There's a bunch of mistakes and they're laughing, but they wrote new songs for that record. Ed started practicing all the time, like obsessively. He knew this was his big shot. Same thing with Roth. He took those vocal lessons. I mean, everyone wanted to be as best as they could possibly be. And if you look at the recording session documentation, you'll see that they didn't, like a lot of bands, come in and do a 10-hour session or, come in at night. They would come in the daytime and do a half day and then go do gigs afterwards. They were playing gigs in the middle of recording that album. So they were just like nonstop. And it's like the Beatles story. The Beatles became as great as they did because they were gigging so much in all those, all day long, all night long things in Germany and Hamburg. I mean, it's like, that's what makes you great. Is just
time,
focus, practice. Better than we all do.
Yeah, right. Exactly. It is all about, how much time you spend with it. You just really got to spend time with it. And when you're young, you have all that time and you can, in their case, they were living at home with mom and dad. I was going to say, one of the things that I want to know about Los Lunas is you and your relationship with them at this point, in the early years of Van Halen. You had met them, you said to me, in that period. Is that right?
Yeah. Now, at that period in time, I'm still this young kid. They're older than me. They're all like at least 4 to 6 years older than me. So I'm just a punk and just wanting to hang out if I can, but definitely see their show. So, if I ran into them, it would be pretty quick and in passing. And I ran into Ed at the guitar store in Pasadena. There was a place called the Sound Chamber.
Yep.
And when I bought my first guitar in 77, I got this like SG copy, really cheap guitar, and I used to carry it in a burlap bag, and it was funny. But I went back I was in college by that point, and I went back for Christmas break, and I needed some strings, and so I went to the Sound Chamber. Went there. There's Edward. He's in the Sound Chamber buying some strings too, and I go, "Hey Eddie," I go, "What's going on, man? I just saw your show at the Civic. You guys were great." And he goes, "Hey, thanks, man." And he goes, "Hey, guess what, man? We're going to go on tour with Black Sabbath." I go, "No way." He goes, "Yeah, and we got a record coming out in April." I was like, "Wow." He goes, "Come see us New Year's Eve at the Whiskey." And I go, "I can't get into the Whiskey. You got to be 21 to get into Whiskey." And, and I said something stupid too. I said, "I really dig that song, Tommy Punk," because that's what I thought they were saying. So loud, it's hard to make out what they're saying. He goes, "That's Atomic Punk." I was like, "Whoa." I was just trying to be cool. I'm just a punk. I'm like a 17-year-old punk, and he's already 23, 24, who knows what.
Right.
So, I'm looking up to these guys, and they're not even that famous yet. They're famous for us in town. But to hear that he finally, crossed that line, I was all excited. So I got back to school. And like I said, I just started playing electric guitar. I'd been playing violin since I was 10, but now I'm onto the electric guitar, and I want to play my Zeppelin stuff and all my hard rock. And, I tell my guitar buddies at school in the dorms, I go, "I know these guys back in my hometown, and they're going to put a record out." They're like, "Okay." And I said, "And they're named Van Halen, and they're going to be big." And they're like, "Who? What?" So they don't know and they don't care. So come April, this record comes out. The day it comes out, I buy it. And I got this thing from Warehouse Records. It's got the original black and white photo inside. And, I go to my friends. I go, "Look, this is them. This is Van Halen." They go, they don't know. They don't care. Play that Zeppelin thing.
Oh, yeah.
So they don't care. But then 2 weeks later, I'm walking around the campus, and coming out of the dorm room windows, "You really got me. You really got me." I'm like, "Oh, fuck. They did it." Like, to me, that was it. That was reality. Now it's like real. And I thought, and from that point forward, I thought, you know what? I'm not going to be a doctor. That's what I'm in school to be, but I'm going to be a guitar player in a rock band. That was 18 years old and a big, that's my big revelation. And I said, they can do it, I can do it.
You know what? That's funny because there's so many people who would watch this that would say exactly what you just said. You know, we all kind of Edward's inspiration just kind of all knocked us on our butt, and we were all like, "Oh, we can do that. That's cool. I want to do that." You know, he kind of inspired a lot.
Yeah, because like I said before, up to this point, I thought, being a rock star, that's just a pipe dream. That's just a fantasy because you have to be British to be a rock star. Right. You're talking Deep Purple, Led Zeppelin, the Who, Rolling Stones. There's no American rock stars really, not in this kind of music. So it's just a fantasy. But once I saw Van Halen do it, I thought that's what I want to do.
So what?
I ruined my life from that forward.
You know what? Though you make an interesting point there is that for that time, and some people wouldn't know this about that period, but like you said, British rock was the blueprint for some of the bands that came through the 80s, I would say. Most of the Van Halen and those kind of groups came from the Zeppelins and Cream, of course, we know that. And so I guess a lot of us don't think about that was the mindset in the 70s coming into the 80s.
It was a weird thing because Van Halen's music is really inspired by early 70s to mid 70s stuff. And that's pretty much what they played. By the end of the 70s, there was already this punk rock thing taking off with the Ramones, and this new wave thing was kind of starting to be a thing in the club. And they didn't like, in a lot of the clubs anymore, they didn't like this hard rock thing, and they weren't booking those bands. And it was kind of it was almost like when grunge came along. It was sort of like, okay, goodbye, hard rock 70s groups. It's all about punk now. But that's, I think, why they wrote Atomic Punk. They were trying to make fun of that movement that was really afoot right then. And but, they triumphed anyway.
What a song!
Yeah,
I love that song. This is one of my favorites to play. It's so much fun. Yeah. So one of the things I want to ask you about Pasadena before we move out of the Pasadena stuff, there's a few things. One, were you ever at their house in Los Lunas?
Yeah. No, I was never there. Like I was saying earlier, at that point in time, I'm just friends of their friends. Like I knew the older guys that were able to go to their house, and really the people going to their house were like their friends from school or other Lodies. They were like the Lodi band. Their fans were people that were getting high and drinking beers and kind of Black Sabbath fans. So that's who they were. And I was a little green behind the ears to be going over to their house in 1976 and all that.
Out with those guys. Right, hanging out.
Luckily, later in life, I got to run into him many times. But right. In those early days, I could only have dreamed to be invited inside.
Right. So we're gonna walk through that. That's going to be an interesting part of the story. One other thing I want to ask you about in Pasadena, and this is just a site there, and there's lore around this spot in where they have carved. The people say it was Alex, but he in the wet cement put Van Halen there in one of the curbs. You know about that place?
I've seen pictures of them writing into the concrete of the curb. I don't know. It's this kind of thing. It's almost like Jim Morrison's grave. It's like you don't know what to believe. Right. It could have been afterwards. Who knows?
It could have been somebody else altogether, right? Could have been somebody else.
Could have been. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So
I'd hate to be the people that own that house right now, because it's like they got drunks and Lodies showing up at like 3 a.m.
Right. That's wild, man. So let's kind of transition from the Pasadena years to what happens with you. You end up a member of King Cobra, but kind of give me your trajectory after the 70s, after the album came out, Van Halen 1. What happened with you, and then how does this all lead back to Edward Van Halen?
Yeah, good question. So after, I had that revelation, that hearing their music coming out of the dorm room windows and thinking, oh my God, this is what I want to really do. This is with my life. This is it. So I immediately took time off of school. As school ended that first year in 78, I was pre-med. I was going to be a doctor.
And so what school?
I was going to UC San Diego. That's where I was going.
Okay. Because
you were hard to get in.
Yeah.
It was cool. It was like study, very competitive. It was like I was lucky to hang it in there. But I decided, no, this isn't what I want to do with my life. So I took some time off. What I did was I took 6 months off and I started working in Pasadena at a stereo store. And that's the other thing. I like equipment. I like, speakers, stereo amps, all that stuff. So I started as a stereo salesman at Now Sound Stereo on Rosemead Boulevard. And I started working there. And, after work, I'd go up and see gigs, either backyard parties, Smile would play, Ready Kilowatt, all these bands. And then I would see at this club called the Wood Sound in Monrovia. That's right next to Pasadena. They would have a lot of these bands that used to play at the Civic, like Stormer, Quiet Riot played in there. I saw them with Randy Rhodes. And, that was the first time I saw Quiet Riot up close with Randy Rhodes. We're talking about I'm 10 feet away because this is a tiny club and they're super loud and you're really close. And I didn't like the way they were dressed at all. I was like, what the hell?
Because they were like into wasn't he into Ronson and all that?
It was super into that Bowie glam thing, like over the top, and they didn't fit in out in our neck of the woods. That's for sure. Maybe in Hollywood. That
I'll tell you something about that I learned on here. I interviewed a girl named Melissa Whitney, and she was one of Kevin DuBro's inner circle, and she was part of the Quiet Riot fan club, and is actually putting a book out about Kevin. Kevin DuBro, he was a photographer first, then he became a singer, and he was, she told me he was actually very influenced by Billy Squier at the time when Billy Squier came out. And he loved
that's funny to hear.
But
I had no idea.
He loved Billy Squier's voice. And if you listen back to Quiet Riot, you can kind of hear sometimes when he would, later in the career, like 83, in that era, his voice you would kind of hear that influence about him. But yeah, Greg Leon was with him at that point, or late after that point you're talking about right now. And
so I wanted to mention that when I was at the Wood Sound and saw Quiet Riot with Randy, I wasn't too impressed with them overall. They had Rudy Sarzo on bass and Drew Forsythe on drums, the whole thing. Mm-hmm. Randy started doing this solo, and it was nothing like Edward. I mean, that was good because a lot of people were copying Edward and doing some tapping and playing licks like that. And Randy was definitely different, but he pulled out an E-bow, if you know what those things are. Sure. And it's like this little metal kind of magnetic thing, and it just makes the strings go off without picking them, and it makes your guitar sound like a violin or a cello. So he started doing a whole solo with an E-bow, and I thought, that's pretty interesting. This guy definitely has some unique chops. But beyond that, I can't stand his band, and they're
right.
So that was that.
It wasn't your thing. So the E-bow, that's interesting because I didn't know an E-bow existed in that period.
Oh yeah, E-bows came out in the mid 70s.
Okay, because of course, I ran across them in the 80s as I got into guitar and found out about them, but I didn't realize that. Interesting.
Yeah, so he did that. Speaking of Kevin DuBro, so if you jump ahead for a second, and I'll come back. I started going to the Starwood quite a bit in 80, 81, which was the tail end of the Starwood. I think by 82, they closed down completely with, punk rock mayhem and all kinds of problems. But towards the end there was all kinds of great hard rock still. You're talking Yesterday and Today would play there a lot. They were Y&T, of course. As soon as Randy took off, then Kevin DuBro called his band DuBro. And he had Greg Leon. Now, Greg Leon, I think I'd seen him at the Wood Sound also playing Sweet 19. Sure. That was his band. It was a trio, and it had Tommy Lee on drums and Greg on guitar, and they were a cool band. I liked them. And then here I see Greg again. I think he was with Dawkins. I saw him playing in Dawkins for a while. And the next thing you know, I see him playing with Kevin DuBro. When I saw him in DuBro, I thought, this guy is the best guitar player I've seen on stage next to Eddie Van Halen. He looks amazing. He had this blue sailor suit bright spandex sailor suit with a little flap, and he had these white capizios and this yellow Charbel guitar. And he was just, his playing was amazing. It was very poppy, very Van Halen-esque, but just, rock and roll playing. He went way heavier after that point in time, but at this point in time, it was really poppy. And people in the audience were like loving Greg, and they would walk over towards his side of the stage, and Kevin started getting really jealous, and you could see it. And he would make these looks at Greg, and, he would try to interrupt his guitar solo, and this full on stage jealousy fit. Next thing you know, they hired a second guitar player. It was Mitch Perry, I believe, who was just a new kid to town. So now they have two guitar players. I'm like, what? Why? Oh no, they've ruined Greg Leon's, showcase. And next thing you know, they kicked Greg Leon out, and then he started his own Greg Leon Invasion after that. And he went heavy metal from that point forward. No more, candy, no more pop metal for him.
Pop metal, yeah. Yeah, Greg was a great guest, and we had some really interesting conversations about some things. He had the Beat It amp that Eddie used to beat it. For Beat It, it was his amp. It was borrowed by. It was actually rented through Andy Brower, and then Andy Brower took Eddie Van Halen and that amp to the studio and sat there for 30 minutes while he cut the solo to Beat It.
Oh, I have no idea. I never heard that story.
Yeah,
wow.
a lot of people don't think it's true, but Andy Brower came onto the Marshall forum where I posted the video, or somebody posted it and verified it and told his part of the story. Now, I haven't interviewed Andy Brower, but and I asked Dave Friedman, and Dave Friedman said that he thought it could have been, but he didn't know in particular. But I tend to think that it's a true story, and
it could be, because maybe he shows up at the studio and he didn't bring his stuff. I know that
he was on tour. There's discussion. A lot of my friends would go back through the tour logs and literally try to pin down when he could have made this trip from New York. I think it was New York, is what he said. But it's been freaking 35 years.
There's mythology involved. I know that Lukather was involved in that session, and I had heard that that's how they got Eddie Van Halen in there, through Lukather recommending him. Yeah. I had no idea about the amps. What an amazing opportunity that Edward played on that song.
Right. Well, one of these days we'll get to Lukather or somebody that was there, and we'll verify things. I've been trying to get Grover Jackson too, because I met Grover years ago, and Greg told a story about the Unchained guitar being in Grover's shop and at the same time as the Bumblebee, which is a really crazy timing thing, because nobody can really line that up. But Greg said,
a lot of those stories, I think some of them are enhanced and like myth. And when I did get to become friends with Ed and talk with him about a lot of these stories, he had his amp right there, his killer Plexi, and he started telling me about it, where he got it in Pasadena, how he had to save up his money, how it didn't even work at first. It was European voltage and all. That's why he had to get the Variac. He went through this whole thing, and then he said, those stories about Jose modding this head, there was nothing done to this head. This head is bone stock. And I just wanted to help out Jose. So, that story, and the thing about boiling the strings, he put that in a magazine just to goof with people, because he just hated how people would hang on everything that he did.
Yeah, I know the voltage, having the voltage saying it went up instead of down or whatever on the Variac. Yeah, he ruined some amps. And yeah, he's some crazy stuff. Yeah, and we'll get into the psyche of him as we get into the deeper part of the story. When you get into
I can continue on that story about how I got
sure,
after college, how that led up to playing in bands and all that. So anyway, I took time off of college, and I went to the Wood Sound and these clubs, and I even saw Rick Derringer on New Year's Eve, 78 to 79 for $5. That's how much it costs to see Rick Derringer at the Wood Sound.
That's wild, man.
So anyway, I got up to 1979 starts, and I've transferred to UC Santa Barbara now as a music major. No more pre-med, no more science. And I'm up there, and looking up my friend Eddie Langholtz. Now, Eddie Langholtz was this guy who used to pick me up at my parents' house and originally told me about Eddie Van Halen in the first place. Now, he's going to school at UC Santa Barbara. And I told him, yeah, I'm transferring up here as a music major. And he goes, why'd you do that, man? This isn't a good music school. So right off, I'm like, oh, he goes, but we started talking about Van Halen. And he goes, hey, you know what? I can give you a copy of this. I have a Van Halen, early tape if you want to get a copy of it. And I go, oh, yeah, definitely. So he gives me this 8-track tape, like 8-track, the kind of things you'd put in a car stereo back in those days. And I still had a really nice cassette deck from my little stint at the hi-fi store. So I made a really cool transfer of this tape that he had. Now, he told me about this tape. He said that he was good friends with Rob Broderick. And, Tommy Broderick was, of course, one of Al's early drum roadies and used to run the sound at their local gigs. And his older brother, Rob, was actually a classmate. And I think they all went to PHS together. And if you look at some of those early pictures, there's one with Ed smoking a cigarette when he's 13 years old in a room. The guy on the drums, that's Rob Broderick.
Okay.
Anyway, so my friend Eddie Langholtz told me the story. He said, that Rob had a reel-to-reel 4-track, and he made a demo of them in Roth's basement in their rehearsal room. And that my friend Eddie was there, clinking quarters on the table to simulate the sound of them being in a bar while they did the song Ice Cream Man, and he was there for this recording and he got a copy of it. And so I had this killer early Van Halen stuff in 79, and that, I would play it all the time. And it had 3 different things. It had the demo that this Rob Broderick had made. It had an early, like either Gazzari's or some other club show that sounded great. And that's the one that they later almost tried to release. And then the third thing on there was a very early demo that had Mark Stone on there on bass. It had that song Angel Eyes, or If I Had My Way, I think was the real title. So this was a great introduction to rare Van Halen. And I got this in 79 and I held on to that, and so I continued on up there, and I got into a band, and we started playing around Santa Barbara. And I said, hey, man, we got to move down to LA. That's where it's at. We got to be playing places like the Starwood. We got to get to LA. And they're like, nah, I don't think so. So I left Santa Barbara after a year and I moved back down to LA in 1980. When I got to 1980 down here, I started working at a stereo store again. I worked at Cal Stereo. Now, Cal Stereo was right next door to Dr. Music, which is a music store there in Hastings Ranch Shopping Center. And that's where Van Halen used to go to buy equipment and stuff quite a bit because it was closer to where they lived. And I met a lot of local musicians there. So I was already, I had played in one band. I was trying to get another band going. While I was working at the stereo store, a lot of people would come through there. And I met this guy, Tommy Gunn, a singer who I started a band with. And I met a couple other guys who were really instrumental in, tying me into this inner circle of people. I met this guy named Nick Panici, who became like an instrumental friend of mine. He's another guitar player. He was a very competitive person. A lot of people didn't like him, but he was a super cool guy. Like he knew all the ins and outs of like getting in backstage. If you didn't like, that was a thing to do back then. It's like if you could get backstage, that's like the golden ticket. So this guy taught me all those skills. And then I met a lot of local musicians. There was a band called Reward, and that had Dana Anderson, Tom Broderick, and this guy, Freddie Johnson on bass. It was a 3-piece, kind of a progressive rock group, and Tom Broderick had this drum kit with octobans and all this intricate stuff. And for a trio, they were amazing. And I would see them rehearse. And this was all because of a friend of mine, Steve, that was a stereo salesman as well. And he was a friend of theirs. And he was also a roadie for the guy that was in Headwinds. Headwinds was a band who opened for Van Halen. They were older than Van Halen. But the guys in Headwinds had disbanded and reformed as a band called Dealer. Now, Dealer had Tommy Lee on drums. That's what he did after Sweet 19. Okay. And it had this guy, Mark Pointer, on keyboards, and a guitar player, singer, Mike Cusick, or Mike Britton, as he goes by. And so I met all these guys in 1980, and it started shaping me as a musician. By 81, I went to GIT. That was like a big deal in a professional musician training school. I continued to go to the Starwood shows with my friend Nick, and we would always sneak upstairs. I would see David Lee Roth up there and try to talk to him. And Roth is like a guy that's really hard to talk to. It's like, first off, he may not even let you talk to him, but if he does, he won't even look you in the eye. He looks at a spot right above your eyes, like he's looking right through you. And you ask him a question, he'll answer a totally different question and just start going on and on about what he wants to talk about. That's David Lee Roth. Well, yeah, I think it's still it.
Yeah, he's still that way. It's like the Riddler or something. He's got like literally like.
He's a brilliant guy, and I always admired him. And he could tell, to this day, he could tell a story like no one else. And you listen to a lot of these early tapes. He tells some amazing stories during songs, in between songs. I mean, that personality really made them what they are. It's too bad about his voice in the end, but
let's kind of talk about a couple things right in that mix. Number one, Roth's contribution, as you just made the point, to Van Halen, and Greg, I thought, did a great job of pulling this out, is how much Roth was involved with. I guess Alex and Roth sort of, the two of them were like a tag team with the business side of this somewhat, I guess. Or Roth was more of a marketeer type person, and Alex was the business guy. Is that appropriate?
That's very true. Roth and Alex were the older guys in the band. Alex was like a dominant person. When you meet these guys, Ed's a little bit shorter than you would expect him. He's like 5'8", 5'9", and Alex is taller than you would have thought. He's like 6'3" or something like that. So it's like they're physically a lot different, but when they're together, Ed will take a half step back and just let Alex do all the talking, and Alex just tells you how it's going to be. So he's in charge. Dave is like, I guess he had to get through Alex to really, cement his place in the band and to create what they did, because it was Alex who was protecting his younger brother. And it was Dave's job to convince Alex that they needed to go in this poppier, kind of esoteric direction, compared to what they had been used to doing. And he did it. He pulled it off. He was relentless. And that was a point I was kind of going to make, is that the one thing I learned through meeting these different people is that in the entertainment business, the people that rise to the top are the ones that have the most compelling personality, that really can be like, it's like a salesman. You could talk someone into something, but you charm them, and you like have your energy and your enthusiasm. And it's the same art of sneaking in backstage. It's like a confidence thing. It's a smooth operator thing. It's like, that's what Roth had. And that's how he propelled his way all the way through. And by being close to someone like Eddie Van Halen, that just charged him to become better than he would have ever been without Eddie Van Halen. It's like the same kind of principle I did when I was in my bands. I would never want to be in a band of guys that were worse than me. I'd always try to get in a band of guys better than me. And I'd be hanging on by a thread, working as hard as I could. And I would always want to pull my way up like that, and there's always a risk that you'll get fired, and I often did. But that's the same principle. It's like compelling drive. And that's what David Lee Roth had. That's what Van Halen had. That's what just a lot of people that I ran into in the business have. And once you have that, you sail through.
Yeah, you know what? Even I think Steve Jobs had said that at one point, that you needed to surround yourself with people that were better than you. That was part of it, his philosophy as well. That you needed to rise with other people, and that's definitely what you're saying here with Roth. Roth was smart. He had there's that talk even in Greg's book about him trying to compel Edward to cut his hair a certain way. They had a look, and Roth had this vision of having. I mean, it seems like to me like Roth had his vision, a large vision, and then you had your mechanical business guy, which was Alex, and then you had Edward, who was kind of the little genius, right? And then Mike, who balanced everything out. There was such a different, because being in bands, like me, the chemistry between the members is the power of a band. Ultimately, what happens with a band depends on that what you make together, and those guys had a certain thing with each person kind of giving their specific power, their strength to the whole.
As a musician, and my other musician buddies, the main thing we would envy about Van Halen is how Edward always had Alex. He never had to audition a drummer. He never had to go out and get a job. He never had to do all those things that we struggled with. He just always had Al, and they were always a team, and he was just so good. Like the people that I know that were his direct friends, they said from the earliest age, 12, 13 years old, he was just a natural. He would listen to something and immediately be able to pick it out, and with accuracy. And, he had that natural talent from day one. And with Alex there, keeping that standard high of anyone else they allowed to be around him and making sure that nobody took advantage of him, they just worked their ass off, and they succeeded. They propelled themselves.
Right. So one other thing I want to ask you is about the Starwood in particular, because that became such a, obviously where they were discovered by Templeman, and that venue itself. What can you tell me about it? What kind of room was it? And you kind of mentioned who was playing there, but as a venue, was it looked upon as the premier venue in town, or?
It was a classy joint. It was not like a beer hall like some of these other places. It wasn't the whiskey, which is, the sticky beer on the floor, and like all kinds of graffiti on the walls in the back. And it was a classy joint. It was down in West Hollywood on Santa Monica Boulevard at Crescent Heights, and it was I guess it had been a fancier club called PJ's before it was the Starwood. But it was a place where bigger name groups would come through there. I mean, there would even be times where Aerosmith would play there under a different name, and same thing with Cheap Trick, and big name people would come through there. It was it was an interesting place. It had two different areas. It had a big giant discotheque dance floor off to one side, and then it had this little restaurant in between them, a little hamburger kind of window, and then a coat check. And then you go into the concert hall room, and it was kind of a tall ceiling, not a huge room, but it had an upstairs area called the Hot 100 Club. And you'd have to be on a list to get up there. Right. And that's where the rock stars would go. That's where they're getting high in the back office, and all the mayhem was happening up there. Right. So this getting into the Starwood was a thing. And there was a lot of great acts that came through there. But you were alluding to the whole Van Halen getting discovered there. What I learned later on through, Kim Fowley, who became a very good client of mine and a good friend, and I was with him for the last 5-6 years of his life. He had a million stories, and one of his great stories involving Van Halen was that he was friends with this guy, Marshall Burrell, who was Milton Berle's nephew. And, Marshall Burrell was using his, association and clout to get in the entertainment business. He wanted to be a talent agent. He didn't really know how to go about getting it, but Kim Fowley saw that was a great card to have. And so Kim Fowley leveraged his potential into a rock and roll scenario. And so one of the first things that happened was that Kim Fowley helped Marshall Burrell set up bookings at the Whiskey, which I guess had been closed for a while. And then it reopened. And one of the first bands that got in there was Van Halen, because, these civic gigs and a lot of, word of mouth, they were starting to be a band that would definitely pack a club. So they gave them a chance, and sure enough, right away, they were packing the Whiskey, and they got a chance to play the Starwood. And so somehow word got to Ted Templeman, and the Warner Brothers executives that, hey, there's this band you got to check out, right? And Marshall Burrell, I think, was involved in getting that going. So the story that I, either read through Greg or had heard through other people, or a conglomeration of all of those together, is that they came down, they were very impressed with the band, and they wanted to sign them right away. And they were saying, so who's your manager? And, Al's like, well, we don't have a manager. And they look over at Marshall standing right there and they go, now you do. He's your manager. And so after that, Kim Fowley called them up and said, hey, so that introduction to Marshall Burrell worked out pretty good for you guys. I heard you're going to get a deal. He goes, here's the favor I want to ask. I got a song I want you guys to record, and it's called Young and Wild.
Oh, wow.
And Kim Fowley was always doing this kind of thing because he existed off of publishing royalties from 50 years worth of productions and bands and songs he'd muscled into. And so this here's a song he had wrote probably the words to, and this other guitar player named Stephen T, who was in a band called Venus and the Razorblades, who had played with Van Halen at the Whiskey. Mm-hmm. I got the demo of that song, and they basically sent that demo over to Ed and said, here, work it up, and you guys do this song, and that's how you pay me back for getting you this introduction. And they did, and it's on the 25 song demo, but Templeman must have thought, it's not that strong of a song, and it's not, so it got left by the wayside. But funny story.
Of course I've heard that, and there's a few songs that were strong songs in the demos. That one guy, I don't know if you've ever heard of him. His name's Jacob DeRaps. He's a kind of a young guy who really loves Van Halen, and they covered a song that was more obscure off the demos and did a new version of it. And I can't remember. I'll think of it in a minute. But it was like a Young and Wild. It was from that same demo set, and it's brand new sound, and it sounds like Edward, that era. It's cool. It's a cool thing. But one of the things that we were talking about a minute ago, you had these tapes, and we'll go forward though. Still, these tapes that you got, you transferred over to cassette. These were demos that you said you got from the inner circle, and then you got a copy of those. Those were the ones that later that we're going to talk about, right?
Yes, absolutely. And that initial little tape I got of the three different things grew and grew and grew because of my ambition. As I became a recording engineer, I wanted to source down that original source tape. I didn't want a copy of a copy. I wanted the master, and we'll get into that. But okay. I eventually amassed a massive collection. Okay,
so let's go from where we were. The last thing that we were talking about was, you were talking about in the early 80s, and you were going out and
so in the early 80s, I went to GIT, and I learned whatever. They were more trying to make you into a session player and a jazz guy, and I wanted to be a rock and roll guy, so I was just pulling out whatever I could for rock and roll. And there was a couple other guys that I still am in touch with that went there, and it was a great experience. But after that, I moved back to Pasadena. I started, playing in bands again. And one of the first people I meet is Doug Anderson. And Doug is, his nickname is Bro Bro. Right. And I think he invented that name. But anyway, the way I met Doug was through a recycler ad. That's how we all met in those days. Because if you were looking to buy an amp or a guitar or sell one, you'd put it in the recycler, which was a free newspaper. Or no, the newspaper cost 75 cents, but you could put a free ad in. And musicians would be finding bands, and the recycler was a giant meeting place. So I met Doug, and he lived in Pasadena on Casa Grande Street, which is the same street Eddie Langholz lived on. Now, Eddie Langholz was that guy that gave me that tape, the guy that picked me up when I was 14 years old, the guy that sort of turned me on to everything. And he knew Eddie, and he knew his family. And Doug was a great guy because he was into heavy metal, like the British heavy metal, in 1980 and 81, way before anyone else. He said, he goes, Mike, check out this magazine, Kerrang! They sell it at Poobah's. It's from England. And they're talking about Saxon. And they're talking about the Scorpions and, all these different bands, Michael Schenker. And, of course, I was already a Schenker fan, but through UFO. But Doug was way into it. So Doug and I started a band. And I think our band was called Virgin Steel, right? And we would wear these wristbands with metal studs, and he was talking about Blackie Lawless being in a band called Sister, and Doug was great friends with Chris Holmes as well, because they're all from that same area. And Chris would always loan Doug his stuff. I think the Ibanez Explorer or Destroyer, it's called. Yeah. The Destroyer that Edward ended up borrowing, I think was, and then Chris would let Doug have it for a while, and they had a connection there. So anyway, Doug and I were great friends, and Doug had a Van Halen tape too. So I had this great tape that I had described already, and Doug had this live tape of Van Halen at the Starwood, right? And so I gave him a copy of mine, he gave me a copy of his, and I would listen to his, and his was funny because every time they would play Running with the Devil, the guy that made the tape was some kind of Jesus freak, and he didn't want to hear the word devil, so he would blank out the tape, running with a So it was like a little frustrating, and when I made my compilation of it, I would have to cut that song out because it was all chopped up anyway. Right. But that's a funny story. So Doug and I remained friends for a long time, and Doug was part of the whole effort that led to me getting these tapes. I don't know if you wanted me to get right into the tape story or how it led up to that, because it was a few years before that happened.
Yeah, whatever you want to do. It's all good.
All right, so I'll talk about the tapes then. So like I said, we exchanged tapes. I was happy to play my tape for anyone who wanted to hear it. It was something I was proud of, and I had a clean copy, and Doug's tape was pretty clean. It was reel to reel. And then years went by. I played in different groups, and like I said, I always tried to be in a band that was better than me. And, sometimes I'd get fired because I wasn't as good as them or whatever. But a lot of groups, I had a great time. I played at Gazzari's with this band, Brand Boulevard. I've played with a band called Romeo. And then I started playing in top 40 bands out in Orange County. And, at some point I thought, I don't know. I don't want to be some like run-of-the-mill musician. I got into this whole thing on some grand vision, a dream of trying to follow in Eddie Van Halen's footsteps. And I don't feel like I'm near good enough to do this. So I got to really decide to take this seriously or get the hell out. So what I decided to do was I got an apartment in Pasadena, just a little one-bedroom place. And, back then rent was like $185 a month, not too expensive. Right. So I didn't have a job. I just had some money saved, and, I barely was eating anything. I just practiced my ass off 10 hours a day, every day. Because I had read a story that Eric Clapton had did that one time. He locked himself in an apartment. So for me to do this, I just took certain records. Like it started with UFO, Michael Schenker. And I took the UFO's Strangers in the Night record, and I just copied every single rhythm and solo, wrote them out, tablature, practiced them over and over and over until I mastered them. Then I went through all 5 or 6 UFO albums, did the same thing. Then I got into the Van Halen stuff, and Deep Purple, and whoever else, anyone. And I just became obsessed, and I just worked my ass off. One of the musician buddies I had at the time was a drummer. He lived in this house. We call it the House on the Hill. It was just like, 8 different people sharing a house, and they had parties every Saturday night. So I had a little party band with him, and we'd get together and we would play all these songs that I would be working my ass off on. It was like an outlet, and I was starting to really get a lot better. And I had this outlet every week. I didn't have to play in a club because we had a house party to do. Mm-hmm. And it was like, a big crowd would be there, and it's fun to play to a house party crowd because they're right in front of you, and if you're playing great and you connect with them, it's like the energy is almost enough to light up the room and electrocute you. It's just amazing. So that was a great thing that I went through. That really took me to a higher point.